The Galactic Academy stood tall in the heart of the stars, its halls bright with silver light, its towers reaching high into the endless sky, and its walls filled with echoes of young voices, voices of alien students who had come from every world in the Union, each one dreaming of glory, power, and knowledge, yet each one carrying in their hearts a shadow. For within the academy there was one trial that all feared, one test that broke even the bravest minds, a place spoken of only in whispers, the trial called the Mind Maze. The Mind Maze was not stone or steel, not a simple hall or a test of strength. It was a creation of thought and fear, a world of shifting walls that moved like liquid, a place that reached into the deepest parts of the mind, pulling out fears, regrets, and secrets, and turning them into living traps. The maze did not test the body, it tested the soul, and most who entered came out trembling, broken, or begging never to return, for the maze was built to reveal weakness, and weakness once revealed could not be hidden again. Among the students of the academy the maze was legend. Some said it had been designed by the first masters of the galaxy, beings who wished to test, not the strong arms of soldiers, but the fragile hearts of leaders. Some said it had a mind of its own, shifting to match the prey that entered, feeding on fear like a predator that never grew tired. Many tried to conquer it, but the maze always won, and so the young cadets spoke of it in fear, dreading the day their names would be called. On one bright morning the hall was filled with murmurs. The next trial had been announced. The maze would open again, and this time new students would be chosen. The aliens whispered to each other, scales trembling, wings folding tight, claws clicking nervously against the floor. None wanted to be chosen, yet none dared admit their fear aloud, for the fear was to be weak, and weakness was shame. The names were read one by one. The hall grew tense. Then silence fell as the final name was spoken. Elias Grant, the human. The silence stretched long, for though the Union was vast, humans were still new to the academy, strange creatures from a small blue world, seen as reckless, simple, and fragile. Some laughed softly, covering their unease with sharp teeth and mocking words. Others whispered that the human would not last even a moment, for how could a species so young, with such a small place among the stars, hope to face what even the greatest minds of the galaxy had failed to master? Elias stood calm, his uniform plain, his eyes steady. He did not bow his head. He did not tremble. He did not smile wide. He simply looked at the door of the maze, as if it were nothing more than a classroom waiting for him. The aliens around him watched with disbelief, some waiting for him to show fear, others waiting for him to run. But he did neither. He simply stepped forward when the command was given, his boots echoing on the shining floor, each step louder than the whispers around him. A group of elder professors watched from above, their eyes glowing with thought. They had seen countless students enter. They had seen the strongest fall. They had seen the proudest broken. Now they waited to see what the human would reveal. Would he scream as the maze tore into his memories? Would he crumble as the shadows of his past rose to devour him? Or would he fight blindly like so many before him, trapped in walls that never ended? The door of the maze opened, light spilling out like mist. Elias did not pause. He did not look back. He walked into the light with the calm of one walking home, and the door closed behind him, leaving the hall in silence. Only the hum of the maze remained, a low sound that made even the strongest students shiver, for they knew the maze was awake. It was hungry, and it had found a new mind to test. The students leaned close to the great psychic mirrors that showed glimpses of what happened inside, the walls shifting, the corridors bending, the air filling with illusions that could break the heart. Some expected to hear screams at once. Others expected to see the human fall to his knees. But instead they saw him walking, slowly, carefully, as if he were not trapped but exploring, his eyes sharp, his hands loose at his side. And when the maze whispered shadows at him, he did not flinch. He only tilted his head and kept moving. The whispers grew louder, images of failure, voices of doubt, regrets shaped like living forms, the kind that had broken countless students before. But the human gave no sign of fear. He walked like a man who had seen worse, like a man who had lived through storms of his own. And the aliens outside grew restless, some muttering that the maze would grow harsher, that it would dig deeper, that no human could hold steady for long. Yet a thin unease began to stir in their hearts, for they could not deny what they saw. The human was not breaking. And so the trial began, a trial that would shake the belief of the academy. For the maze that no one could escape had found a challenger unlike any it had faced before. The maze closed behind Elias, with a sound like a heartbeat, heavy and low, the kind of sound that settled in the chest of every listener. The alien students outside shifted uneasily, for they knew what awaited within, yet they could not turn away from the psychic mirrors that shimmered before them, mirrors that bent light and thought into pictures, giving them glimpses of what the chosen cadet faced in the ever-changing depths of the mind maze. Inside the maze, Elias found no walls of stone or steel. Instead, he walked through corridors made of shifting glass that pulsed with strange colors. Each wall seemed alive, bending as if breathing, whispering as if filled with voices. The floor glowed faintly beneath his boots like a trail of embers. The ceiling stretched endlessly into shadows. There was no end in sight, no path clear, only turns upon turns, shifting again and again, designed to confuse and trap the mind. Other students before him had run at this moment. They had cried out. They had clawed against the walls that bent like water. Some had curled up in despair as the maze whispered their failures. Yet Elias did none of these things. He did not rush. He did not freeze. Instead, he slowed his steps and let his eyes drift across the changing corridors, his breath steady, his shoulders loose, as if he were strolling through a garden and not a trap woven by fear. The maze began its work quickly, shadows sliding across the glass walls, voices stirring in the air, whispers that tried to sound like people from his past, voices that spoke of weakness, of mistakes, of shame. They told him he was too small, too young, too foolish to be standing in the great halls of the galaxy. They showed him pictures of failure, images of standing alone while others laughed, memories bent and twisted to wound him. Yet Elias only tilted his head, listening as if they were nothing more than passing echoes carried by the wind. Alien students outside the maze shifted uneasily as they watched. The images on the mirrors reminded them of their own trials. One with scales of silver whispered that when he entered, he had seen his world burn in oceans of fire, the flames licking at his family, the cries of his people ringing in his ears. He had fallen to his knees and begged to be let out before the fire swallowed him. Another with wings folded tight admitted he had seen himself fail over and over, no matter how many times he tried. The maze had trapped him in loops of defeat until he could not think, only scream. The others nodded, each carrying their own scars, for all of them had been touched by the cruelty of the maze. Yet Elias, the human, moved through it as if the illusions were no more than shadows on a wall. He gave no sign of terror, no cry of despair. Instead, a small sound escaped his lips, a low chuckle, soft but clear, a sound that echoed strangely in the endless corridors. The watching aliens gasped. Never before had anyone laughed inside the maze, for laughter was the one thing fear could not bear, and in that single moment they felt the first fracture in the maze itself. The professors above leaned forward, their eyes glowing brighter. These beings of wisdom had studied the maze for centuries. They had mapped its layers, measured its strength, but never had they seen it mocked. One whispered that the human was not fighting the maze, nor fleeing from it. He was ignoring it, and that alone was more dangerous than any weapon, for the maze thrived on attention, on belief, on fear. To be ignored was to be weakened. Elias walked slowly, his boots tapping lightly against the glowing floor, his hands brushing the shifting walls as though testing their rhythm. The illusions pressed harder, growing darker. The corridors filled with monsters shaped from memory and nightmare, sharp teeth glistening, eyes glowing like fire, claws reaching for his throat. Yet when they lunged, he only stepped aside, as if moving past shadows cast by flickering light. He did not strike them. He did not run from them. He treated them like tricks, and with every step forward the illusions shattered into shards of glass that melted into the air. Students outside clutched their seats, their hearts racing as they watched the impossible unfold. One hissed that the maze was playing with him, that soon it would crush him with its true form. Another growled that the human would beg for mercy before the end. Yet their voices shook, for though they wished to believe the maze was invincible, what they saw before their eyes told a different story. The human was not breaking. The maze twisted violently, its corridors bending like serpents, its walls shaking with sound. It poured memory upon memory into Elias, memories that were not even his, whole lifetimes of sorrow, entire worlds of pain, the failures of strangers, the screams of forgotten victims, every dark thing it could pull from the galaxy's mind. It gave to him, hoping to drown him in a tide of grief and horror. The mirrors outside shook with the weight of it, students covering their faces with trembling, claws unable to watch. But Elias walked on, steady and calm, his face unreadable, his lips moving with quiet words none could hear, as though he were humming a tune to himself, as though the storm around him was nothing more than rain against a window. He stopped once, tilted his head, and smiled faintly. Then he spoke aloud, his voice echoing through the maze, clear and steady. "Is that all you have?" Gasps erupted in the hall outside, students looking at one another with disbelief. Never had anyone spoken to the maze in such a way. Never had anyone dared to mock its power. Yet the human had done so without hesitation, and though the maze roared in fury, bending the corridors tighter, sending rivers of shadow to swallow him, the fear in the hall was no longer directed at the maze. It was directed at the one walking through it. The professors whispered among themselves, some declaring it impossible, others whispering that perhaps the human mind was wired differently, not bound by the same rules as their species. One old master with eyes like burning stars muttered that perhaps the maze had finally met something it could not consume. For humans, unlike the others, did not fear in the same way. Their strength lay not in resisting fear, but in turning it into fuel, into laughter, into defiance. The maze grew restless, its illusions flickering, its whispers faltering, as though uncertain. For the first time in memory it had encountered prey that did not feed it. And in that faltering moment something deeper stirred. The students watching felt it, a shift in the air, a tremor that ran through the foundations of the maze itself, like cracks forming in stone, invisible but real. Elias paused in a wide chamber, its walls glowing with shifting light, its floor rippling like water. He stood at the center and looked around slowly. Then he knelt and touched the ground with his hand, as if feeling the rhythm of the maze. And he whispered softly to himself, though the mirrors carried his words for all to hear. "It is not a maze, it is a riddle." The words sent a chill through the hall, students stiffening, professors staring in silence, for none had ever spoken of the maze as anything but a trap. Yet the human had given it a new name, a puzzle rather than a prison, and in naming it so, he had weakened its hold. For if it was only a riddle, then it could be solved, and if it could be solved, then it could be defeated. And in that moment, with the echoes of his words still hanging in the air, the maze trembled. In the great hall of the academy, the alien students leaned close to the psychic mirrors, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. The images inside showed the human, walking with steady steps through the shifting corridors of the maze, and each heartbeat that passed without his collapse deepened the unease in their chests. The maze had broken them all once, and to see another moving through it with calm, and even with hints of amusement, felt like a wound to their pride and to their fear. One young alien with horns of crystal spoke first, his voice trembling as he remembered the day of his trial. He told of how the maze had shown him his family, standing on a cliff as endless storms tore the world apart, and he had run to them only to find they were shadows that melted in his arms, leaving him crying alone. He admitted that he had begged for release. After only a few minutes his will shattered, and the shame of it still burned in him. Another student with 4 dark eyes whispered of his own test. He had been shown endless battles that he could never win. Each time he lifted his weapon his enemies grew stronger, and each time he tried to strike they laughed and crushed him again. And again the loop tore his mind, until he screamed to be freed. Even now, when he closed his eyes, the sound of that mocking laughter haunted his dreams, and he could not sleep without fear. The others listened, each recalling their own defeat. Some had seen their worlds consumed by fire, others had seen the faces of their ancestors turned away in scorn. Some had faced monsters born of their own nightmares. Each carried scars that had never healed, and to watch the human walk unharmed through the same torment filled them not only with disbelief, but with dread. For if he could do what they could not, then what did that mean about the strength of his kind? Above them the professors whispered among themselves, their glowing eyes watching the mirrors with sharp intensity. One said the human was reckless, another said he was gifted, one muttered that perhaps his mind was too simple to be broken. But even as the words left his lips, none truly believed them, for simplicity did not explain laughter in the face of fear, and calm in the heart of madness. The maze thrived on thought and belief, and yet the human seemed to treat it as nothing more than a puzzle to be solved. Inside the maze, Elias kept moving. The illusions grew darker, twisting into shapes designed to pierce the heart. Rivers of shadow rolled across the floor. Teeth and claws formed from black glass lunged at him. Screams echoed from every wall, the voices of those he had never known, crying for help, cursing his name, blaming him for failure. Yet he only brushed his hand along the wall as if tracing patterns, and whispered to himself words too soft for most to hear, a rhythm, a tune, a reminder that fear was only noise. The students watching felt the weight of the maze pressing against them. Even through the mirrors, their claws shook, their wings quivered. Some turned their faces away, unable to endure the reflection of their own past terrors. They muttered that the maze would break him soon, that no mind could last forever, but their voices lacked strength, and each time the human took another calm step, their doubt grew heavier, like chains upon their hearts. One elder professor leaned forward, his voice low, yet carrying through the chamber. He said that the maze was not truly a trap of walls, but a mirror of thought. It reflected what the prey feared most and fed upon it, until nothing was left. He said that the human had given it no food, only silence and indifference, and perhaps that was why it trembled, for hunger without nourishment turns to weakness. The alien with wings clenched his talons and hissed, saying that humans were reckless. They did not respect power. They did not understand fear, and that was why they mocked it. But another older student shook his head slowly and replied that perhaps it was not recklessness, but something else, something none of them could name, a way of seeing the maze not as a prison, but as a challenge. And if that was true, then maybe humans were far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. Elias came to a place where the maze shifted into a wide arena, its walls towering high, its floor cracked. With glowing lines across the space rose a figure, tall and dark, a perfect copy of Elias himself, his face twisted with anger, his eyes burning with scorn. The doppelganger raised a weapon shaped from shadow and advanced with slow, measured steps. The maze had given him his own reflection, his own possible failure. The mirrors outside shook with power. Students gasped, for they knew this was one of the maze's cruelest tricks. The reflection was always stronger, always sharper, always embodying the weakness the prey could not admit to, and many who faced it fell screaming, broken by the truth of their own flaws. Yet Elias only tilted his head, studying the figure, then gave a quiet laugh. He spoke aloud, not in fear, but in calm words, saying that a reflection has no life of its own and cannot harm unless given permission. The shadow Elias struck with fury, its blade cutting the air, but the true Elias stepped aside with easy grace. The strike passed through like smoke, and the shadow staggered confused, and then shattered into fragments of glass that fell and melted into the glowing floor. The students outside recoiled, unable to believe their eyes. One whispered that no one had ever defeated their reflection. Another stammered that the maze was faltering, its strength bending where it had once been. Unbreakable whispers spread like fire through the hall, voices rising in disbelief and fear, for the maze had always been the one thing that united them all in dread, and now that dread was crumbling before a human. The professors remained silent, but their eyes betrayed unease. They had trained countless generations. They had relied on the maze to test the truth of every mind. Yet if one cadet could make it bend, then the foundations of their teaching trembled as well. And in the silence between them, an unspoken thought grew. Maybe the maze had not measured all beings equally. Maybe the humans brought something new, something dangerous. Inside, Elias kept moving, his pace slow and unhurried. He began to hum a tune, a soft rising melody that echoed through the shifting halls. The maze howled in answer, walls bending violently, floors cracking, illusions rushing like storms. But the tune did not falter. It carried across the mirrors like a thread of calm, weaving into the ears of all who listened. And though the aliens tried to resist it, they felt something stir inside them, not fear, but an unfamiliar spark of hope mixed with awe. The maze pressed harder, pouring visions of worlds dying, of friends betraying, of battles lost. Yet Elias whispered again to himself, as though speaking a truth no illusion could touch. He said that fear is only a question, and every question has an answer. The words rippled through the maze, striking its foundations. The walls flickered, the whispers faltered, the corridors bent, then shivered as if caught in doubt. And for the first time in living memory, the maze hesitated. The students gasped, for they could feel the shift through the mirrors. They clung to one another, whispering that if the maze could hesitate, then perhaps it could be solved, perhaps it was not eternal, as they had always believed, and that thought frightened them more than any illusion had ever done, for if a human could turn their deepest nightmare into nothing more than a puzzle, then what power did such a mind truly hold? The professors closed their eyes, hiding their thoughts from the students, yet inside they too felt the fracture. One muttered that the human had named the maze a riddle, and in naming it so, he had rewritten its nature. Another said that names carried power, and perhaps that was the secret. Perhaps humans had a way of seeing the universe, not as it was, but as it could be. In the great hall, silence fell heavier than stone, as all eyes remained fixed on the human walking through the maze, unharmed, unbroken, and smiling faintly, as though the trial feared him instead of the other way around. And in that silence the fear of the aliens grew. The maze was alive with restless motion, its walls shifting faster, its colors bending like storms of fire and shadow. The floor cracked and rippled as if great forces pressed from beneath, the air thick with whispers and cries that poured into the ears of the human who walked steadily at its center. Elias Grant did not run, he did not scream, he did not strike at the illusions that lunged at him. Instead, he slowed his steps and tilted his head as though he were listening not to fear but to rhythm. Outside the mirrors, the alien students leaned closer, their scales, their wings, their fur trembling with unease. Each one had seen the maze in its cruelest form. Each one had been broken by it. Yet now they saw the human treating it not as an endless prison, but as something else, something smaller. He looked around at the illusions as though they were pieces of a puzzle scattered before him, and the calm on his face unsettled them more than any scream could. The professors above whispered to each other, their eyes sharp with hidden worry. They had long believed that the maze could not be solved, only endured for a time before it consumed the spirit. Yet this human walked as though he had already solved it, and now moved through it simply to confirm what he had guessed. One professor muttered that perhaps the human mind was not weighed down with the same burdens as theirs. Perhaps it was not the strength of his will, but the difference of his thought that gave him this strange power. The maze twisted again, walls folding into impossible angles, corridors stretching in spirals, the ground breaking into floating shards of light, each shard carrying an image of failure. One showed Elias alone on a battlefield, surrounded by fallen comrades. Another showed him cast out of the academy, mocked by every alien voice. Another showed Earth burning under alien fire. Yet Elias did not look away. He crouched and touched one shard with his hand, watching the image ripple. Then he smiled faintly and whispered that all puzzles used fear as decoration, but the answer always lay beneath the decoration. The mirrors carried his words into the hall. The students gasped, and some shivered, for they had never considered the maze in such terms. To them it was alive, a predator that devoured their minds. Yet the human spoke of it as though it were a toy, as though every shadow and scream was nothing more than surface paint over a riddle waiting to be solved. The maze howled, its illusions pressed harder. Rivers of black fire poured across the floor. Storms of shattered glass filled the air. Monstrous shapes rose from the walls with claws and teeth dripping venom. Yet Elias stood at the center and closed his eyes, breathing slowly. He let the storm surround him. Then he opened his mouth and spoke a single sentence, clear and calm. He said that riddles only seem impossible until you stop fearing them. The illusions froze their forms, flickering. The students outside held their breath. One with horns of crystal muttered that when he had been here, he could not even think, he could only scream. Yet this human was giving lessons to the maze itself. The idea was too strange to hold, yet none could deny what they saw. Elias began to move again, this time tracing shapes in the glowing floor with the tip of his boot. He drew circles and lines as though connecting hidden marks. The walls bent in response. The corridors shifted in rhythm with his movements, as if the maze itself was answering his gestures. The students gasped again, some whispering that he was commanding it, others whispering that he was playing with it. But all of them knew they were watching something no one had ever seen before. The professors leaned forward, one speaking in a low voice, saying that perhaps the human was seeing patterns that their minds could not, that his kind did not view the maze as alive, but as a system, as a problem with rules. And if rules existed, then solutions existed too. Another professor, with eyes like fire, muttered that this was why humans were feared even before they entered the stars, because where others saw prisons, humans saw games. Where others saw limits, humans saw doors. The maze roared, the sound like thunder rolling through endless caverns. It tried to overwhelm him, with its voice 1,000 tones, speaking at once, telling him he was weak, that he would fail, that nothing waited for him but despair. Yet Elias laughed softly, the sound cutting through the storm. He raised his voice and said that questions shouted 1,000 times were still only questions, and questions always begged for answers. The walls flickered, the ground trembled, the illusions grew uncertain, some fading into mist, some collapsing into shards. The mirrors outside shook so hard that several students cried out, covering their eyes from the storm of images. Yet through it all the human kept walking his pace, steady, his hands loose at his sides, his calm more terrifying than any scream could ever be. The alien students looked at one another, fear rising in their hearts. But it was not fear of the maze any longer. It was fear of what this meant about humans. One whispered that if they could turn the maze into a riddle, what could they do to enemies in war? Another said that if they could laugh at fear itself, then nothing could truly control them. A third muttered that perhaps the Union had made a mistake inviting humans into the academy, for they were not simply another species, they were something else. Inside, Elias came to a place where the maze shaped itself into a great hall, a mirror of the academy itself, filled with rows of students, each one staring at him, their eyes glowing with mockery. They laughed at him, they cursed him, they told him he did not belong, they told him he was nothing more than a child pretending to walk among giants. The voices rose higher until they shook the air itself. Elias stood at the center and listened, his eyes calm. Then he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Once the sound echoed like a crack of lightning. The illusions froze mid-laughter, their mouths opened, their eyes wide. He spoke into the silence, saying that mockery was only noise, and noise could never define truth. With that, the entire hall of illusions shattered into dust, leaving him alone in an empty space, glowing faintly with light. The students outside gasped louder than before. Many recoiled, unable to believe that the human had broken one of the maze's cruelest tricks. With nothing but a gesture, some clutched at their chests, as if the impact had struck them too. The professors stared in silence, their lips pressed tight, for they knew now that something had shifted, something that could not be undone. Elias walked onward, his eyes scanning the walls, his lips moving softly, as though reciting a lesson to himself. He muttered that fear was a mask, and riddles always wore masks that could be removed one by one. The corridors opened before him, as if yielding to his words, the maze bending not in triumph, but in hesitation. In the hall, the students whispered endlessly, their voices weaving together like a rising storm. One said that perhaps the human was not solving the maze, but teaching it. Another said that the maze was alive, and if it was alive, then it now knew fear for the first time, for it had found something it could not consume. The professors exchanged glances, silent but heavy with thought. One old master whispered that they had underestimated Earth, that they had believed its people fragile, but fragility could bend into resilience, and resilience could bend into defiance, and defiance was the one force the maze had never prepared for. The maze twisted in fury, its walls trembling, its corridors shaking as if storms of thought and memory were crashing against themselves. The ground split into rivers of fire and glass, the air filled with screams that were not screams, but echoes of every voice Elias had ever known, and yet had never heard. Each sound sharpened to pierce his heart, to break his calm, to pull him into despair. Yet he stood still in the center of the storm, his eyes steady, his breath slow, his face unreadable, as though the chaos around him was nothing more than a song played too loud. The alien students outside pressed against the psychic mirrors, their eyes wide, their voices hushed, their claws trembling. Some begged for the professors to end the trial before the maze destroyed him. Others shook their heads, whispering that the maze could never be destroyed, that no living mind could bend it. And yet what they saw with their own eyes betrayed their belief, for the maze itself looked unsettled, its patterns broken, its illusions faltering like a beast unsure of its prey. Elias crouched low and placed his palm against the glowing floor, his fingers tracing the cracks that pulsed with light, as though they were veins carrying the life of the maze. He drew shapes, circles, lines, triangles, marking invisible patterns. The walls rippled in answer, bending not against him, but with him, as though his touch rewrote their rhythm. The students gasped louder, their whispers rising like wind through the hall. One cried that he was speaking to it, another hissed that no one could command the maze, and yet there it was, bending to the hand of a human. The professors leaned forward, their voices tight. One said that perhaps the maze was not being commanded, but being solved. Another muttered that humans saw the world in ways none of their kind could grasp. One elder with scales of bronze, whispered that to a human fear itself was only a puzzle, a question to be answered, and the maze, which thrived on fear, had never faced a creature that treated it like a riddle. Inside, the storm-deepened illusions poured like rivers, memories, not his own, crashing against his mind, armies, falling worlds, burning faces twisted in agony, reaching for him, demanding his guilt, demanding his sorrow. The maze hurled them all with fury, hoping to bury him under the weight of despair. But Elias did not fall. He knelt and pressed his hand harder against the ground, whispering words too soft for most to hear, though the mirrors carried them to the hall. He said that sorrow without truth is only noise, and noise can be silenced. The illusions froze, the screams faltered, the rivers of fire dimmed, the walls shivered. Elias rose to his feet, his hand still tracing the glowing cracks. Then he spoke again, louder this time, saying that fear is a question, and every question has an answer. With those words, the ground beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat, the light rising, brighter cracks spreading outward through the corridors like veins of fire. The maze itself shuddered, as though something deep within had been struck. The students recoiled, pressing their backs against the walls of the hall. The mirrors shook so violently that images fractured into shards before reforming again. They had never seen the maze wounded. They had never imagined it could bleed, yet in that moment they knew it was bleeding, its power unraveling before their eyes, because a human had named its heart not as a terror, but as a riddle. Elias walked forward, each step heavy with rhythm, his boots tapping like a drumbeat. The walls bent away from him, the corridors that once closed to trap now opened like doors. The illusions that once attacked now hesitated, their forms flickering, uncertain, monstrous shapes of glass and shadow reaching toward him, but fading before they touched him. He looked at them with calm eyes and said softly that lies cannot stand before truth, and in that moment each figure shattered into dust that vanished into the air. The maze roared in rage, a sound deeper than thunder, louder than storms, its fury shaking the halls of the academy itself. Students clutched their ears, professors tightened their grips, yet Elias only straightened his shoulders and raised his voice above the roar. He shouted that fear was not his master, that fear was not a prison, that fear was only a mask, and masks can be removed. His words struck like lightning, the walls split wide, the corridors bent backward, collapsing into themselves, light flooding into every shadow. The mirrors blazed with brightness, forcing students to shield their eyes. They cried out that the maze was breaking. They begged for the trial to be ended before the academy itself was torn apart. But the professors stood silent, their eyes glowing with fierce intensity, for they knew they were watching not the end of a student, but the end of an illusion that had ruled them all for centuries. Inside, Elias came to the heart of the maze, a vast chamber, shaped like a sphere, its walls alive with light and shadow flowing together in endless patterns, voices rising from every surface, speaking every fear, every doubt, every shame. At once the sound was deafening, the light blinding, the heat suffocating. Yet he stood at the center, his arms loose, his eyes sharp. He closed them for a moment, then opened them again, calm as still water. He knelt once more and drew a final shape into the glowing floor, a circle within a circle crossed by a single line. As he drew it, the chamber quaked, the voices screamed, the walls bent violently. But he did not stop. When the final line was complete, he raised his head and spoke, not in anger, but in quiet certainty. He said, "You are only a question, and I am your answer." The chamber shook as though the universe itself had cracked. The walls split open, light poured out like a flood. The voices wailed and then fell silent. The entire maze trembled once more, then shattered into a storm of fragments, each shard of glass and shadow dissolving into nothingness, until Elias stood alone in a void of pure silence, his breath steady, his eyes calm, his lips curled into a faint smile. The mirrors outside went dark, the images gone. The students panicked, thinking the human destroyed, but then light returned, showing him standing untouched in the center of the void. And when he spoke, the hall heard his words as though he stood beside them. He said simply, "I am done." The silence that followed was heavier than any roar. The students did not laugh, they did not whisper, they did not breathe, for they knew what they had seen. The maze that had haunted their kind for generations had been broken, not with force, not with power, but with thought, with defiance, with a human way of seeing. The professors did not speak, their faces unreadable, yet in their eyes shone something no student had ever seen before, not fear, not anger, but respect, though mixed with unease, for they knew the truth. Humans had not simply passed the trial, they had changed it, and with that change the balance of the academy, and perhaps of the galaxy itself, had shifted. And so Elias Grant walked out of the maze, his steps steady, his head held high, while behind him the echoes of what had been broken lingered in silence. For the maze that once ruled the minds of all was now nothing more than a memory of fear defeated by a human who treated it like a simple riddle. The door of the maze opened with a low hum like the sound of a distant storm. Fading into silence, the light poured outward, filling the great hall, and every eye turned toward it. Alien students of every kind, wings, folded tight scales, shivering horns, trembling claws pressed against the floor, all waiting to see whether the human had survived or whether the maze had finally devoured him as it had devoured countless others before him. When Elias stepped out, he was calm, his uniform marked with faint dust, his hair damp with sweat, yet his stride steady, his eyes clear. He walked as though nothing within had harmed him, as though he had simply taken a quiet walk through the gardens outside the academy. The mirrors above flickered dim and lifeless, showing nothing but static, as if the maze itself had been silence broken from within, and the weight of that truth pressed against the hall like a mountain. No one spoke. The students who once laughed at him now stared in wide-eyed silence. Some could not meet his gaze, others shrank back into the shadows, as though afraid of being seen by him, for they remembered their own trials. They remembered screams, their knees against the glowing floor, their cries for release, their shame. And now before them stood a human who had walked out unbroken, who had smiled in the face of fear, who had ended the maze with words rather than weapons. The professors above remained still, their robes heavy, their glowing eyes fixed upon the human, their voices trapped within their throats, for they had witnessed what none believed possible. The maze was meant to be eternal, it was meant to be undefeatable, it was meant to reveal the truth of weakness in every mind, yet it had fallen before a cadet who treated it as nothing more than a riddle to be solved, and this truth weighed upon them more than any illusion. Elias did not bow, he did not boast, he did not raise his arms in triumph. He simply walked to the center of the hall, where all could see him, his boots echoing against the silver floor, each sound louder than the beating hearts around him. He paused, then glanced upward, toward the professors, his eyes steady and unreadable, as though he had no need for recognition and no hunger for reward. He stood as though the act itself was enough, and nothing more was required. The students whispered at last, their voices rising like a wave of unease. One hissed that it was impossible, another muttered that perhaps the maze had chosen to fail itself rather than bend to him, yet another argued that they had all seen it shatter with their own eyes, and denial could not hide the truth. Their whispers grew into arguments, some in awe, some in fear, yet none in laughter, for laughter no longer held power in the presence of one who had walked where none had walked and returned without scars. The professors whispered among themselves, their voices careful. One spoke of danger, saying that humans could not be measured by the same scales as others. Another replied that danger and brilliance often wore the same mask, and perhaps what they had seen was both a warning and a promise. One elder, with skin like molten stone, whispered that the galaxy had always feared the unknown, and now the unknown had stepped into their halls, wearing the face of a human. Elias remained silent through their whispers, his gaze wandering across the hall, as though studying not their fear, but the quiet that followed. He seemed more curious than proud, more thoughtful than victorious, as if he himself was not surprised by what had happened, as if he had expected it all along. He took a slow breath, and then turned toward the exit, walking with the same steady pace that had carried him through the maze itself, leaving behind silence, heavier than chains. The alien students watched him go, their hearts heavy with thoughts they could not speak. One with wings recalled his own failure, the screams that had torn him apart, and now wondered if those screams meant nothing, if they had only been lies painted by the maze. Another with crystal horns lowered his head, feeling shame heavier than before, for he had fled in terror, while the human had laughed. A third muttered that if humans could turn fear itself into nothing, then no power could truly hold them. The silence deepened. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of realization, each mind weighed down by the knowledge that the maze, the eternal test, the breaker of spirits, had been undone. And if it could be undone, then what else that they had believed eternal might also be false? The hall itself seemed to tremble under the weight of that question. Above, the professors stood slowly, their robes rustling, their glowing eyes dim with heavy thought. They gave no judgment, no praise, no punishment, only silence, for even they did not know how to name what they had seen. The maze was their greatest tool, their sharpest truth, and it had been shattered by a human cadet with steady eyes and a quiet laugh They knew that the academy would never be the same. They knew that their teaching would never again carry the same certainty, and they feared what that meant for the galaxy. In the dorms that night, the whisper spread like fire, every student speaking in hushed tones, the story growing with every telling. Some said he had destroyed the maze with a single word. Others said he had walked through without seeing a single illusion. Some even claimed he had spoken to it and made it obey. Yet in every version, one truth remained: Elias had won, and the maze had lost, and that truth was enough to shake the hearts of all who heard it. Elias himself sat quietly in his chamber, his hands folded, his eyes staring at the faint stars beyond the window. He did not speak of victory. He did not write of triumph. He simply breathed the calm breath of one who had faced fear and found it wanting. He knew the whispers spread. He knew the professors would debate his future, yet none of it weighed upon him. He had walked the maze and named it for what it was, and that was enough. The academy, however, did not sleep. The halls restless with unease, the students turning in their beds, the professors whispering behind closed doors. The maze had been their anchor, their measure of truth, and now it was gone, and in its place stood only questions. What were humans truly? What lay hidden in their minds? What strength had carried Elias through what fear could not touch? In the silence of the academy, one thing became clear to all, though none dared speak it aloud. The galaxy had changed that day, not with fire, not with war, not with conquest, but with the quiet, steady steps of a human cadet who solved what none believed solvable and left behind silence that would echo for generations. The hall lay quiet under the pale glow of the new light, silence thick and heavy, silence deeper than the roar of battle, silence that pressed against the hearts of every predator gathered within these walls, silence so complete that the faint sound of the human's breath seemed to echo across the chamber. The apex remained kneeling, its horns lowered, its massive frame trembling with more than exhaustion, trembling with the weight of a truth it could not crush, and the leaders on their thrones sat frozen, their claws trembling against cold stone, their wings folded tight, their eyes wide with a fear they had never known before. The predators who had once laughed and roared now stared at the small figure standing alone in the center of the chamber. No claws, no armor, no wings, no fangs, only calm eyes and steady breath, only patience and certainty, only the strength to face what none of them had dared face. And in that silence they saw something that unsettled them more than defeat. They saw the end of the old order and the beginning of something they could not name. The human raised his gaze to the ceiling where the broken fragments of the hierarchy drifted like dust of dying stars. The old chart gone, erased from their world, erased from their minds. The light now filled the hall, equally touching every predator, without ranks, without levels, without chains, and the human spoke again, his voice steady and clear, carried into every corner like water filling cracks. This is the silence of freedom, he said. This is what you feared, you thought. Without the chart there would be nothing but chaos. Yet you feel now there is still order, not an order of chains, not an order of fear, but an order of choice. You are no longer bound, you are no longer trapped, you are no longer blind, you are free. The words spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Some lowered their heads, unable to face the weight of truth. Some trembled, their claws scraping the floor. Others whispered in voices they barely recognized, their own voices, filled with awe instead of rage, with fear instead of arrogance, with questions instead of certainty. The silence was not emptiness, it was awakening. The apex lifted its head slowly, its eyes burning, but softer now, its voice rough, yet quiet. This silence is heavy, it said, it crushes like mountains, it strips me of what I was. If there is no law, no chain, no chart, then what am I? What is predator? What is prey? What is the meaning of our strength? The human looked at the apex unflinching and answered, you are what you choose to be, not what a chart names you, not what fear commands you. Strength is not in standing above another, strength is in standing without the need to measure yourself against another. Your strength is what you do, not what you rank. The apex roared low, a roar not of rage, but of pain. Its claws dug into the floor as if seeking anchors. In a storm its wings shook as though ready to tear themselves apart. Yet even in its roar the hall heard the sound of truth, the greatest predator broken not by claws, but by words, not by wounds, but by awakening. One of the younger hunters stepped forward, its scales still bright, its wings not yet scarred by war, its voice trembling yet loud enough to carry. If the chart is gone, then I am not bound to the bottom, then I am not doomed to be nothing, then I may rise not by fear, but by choice. The hall stirred again, whispers rolling like a wave across the predators. More voices followed, some shouted that it was madness, others that it was hope, some cried that without ranks their world would end, others whispered that perhaps their world had just begun. The silence shifted, no longer only heavy, now filled with questions, filled with thoughts that had never been allowed. The human stood in the center, calm as always, not pushing, not demanding, only present, only steady, and his presence itself was enough to guide them. His silence was stronger than their roars, his calm stronger than their claws, his patience stronger than their fear. The silence after was no longer emptiness, it was the soil of change. The leaders of the hall finally rose, their eyes weary, their bodies tense. One spoke, its voice cracked and trembling. What you have done cannot be undone. The chart is gone, the law is gone, but you must know the galaxy will not forget. It will fear you, it will resist you, it will hate you. The human turned to them, his gaze unbroken, his voice calm. They may fear, but fear fades. They may resist, but resistance breaks. They may hate, but hate cannot stand forever against truth. I did not come to rule you. I did not come to destroy you. I came to show you that the chain was always broken, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The leaders bowed their heads, not in surrender, but in grim acknowledgement, for they too knew the truth, once seen, could not be unseen, once felt, could not be erased. The silence of freedom could not be drowned out by old roars of law. The apex rose slowly, at last, its body still mighty, yet its pride torn, its voice deep, yet quieter than before. It looked down at the human and said, you are not prey, you are not predator, you are something else, something beyond the law, something outside the chain. And the hall shook with the weight of the words. The human gave no boast, gave no roar. He simply looked back with eyes calm and steady and said, we are human, and that was enough. The silence deepened again, yet it was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of recognition. The predators shifted uneasily, but no one moved against him, no one mocked, no one laughed, no one roared. The silence after was not emptiness, it was change, it was the sound of an age ending and another beginning. The hall that once echoed with violence now stood quiet. The predators, who once lived by claw and chain, now sat in stillness, and the human walked slowly to the center of the light, standing beneath it as though he were not a conqueror, but only a mirror reflecting what had always been there. And in that moment the silence became eternal. The silence became the new law. For the predators knew they would never again see the world as they had before. They knew the chart would never return. They knew the human had fixed what they thought unbreakable, not by strength, not by blood, but by truth and calm and patience. And in that silence the galaxy itself shifted. The silence after was the beginning of everything new.